This is Focus with Jack Caudill.
Good evening, I'm Jack Caudill. Welcome to this month's edition of Focus. This month we are previewing the session of the South Dakota State Legislature. We get started in a little over a week here in South Dakota. Three guests with us to talk about that tonight. Representative Scott Odenbach, a Republican. He is the majority leader. He is from District 31 out of Spearfish. Also with us tonight is Representative Mike Derby, a Republican from District 34 here in Rapid City, and Senator Red Dawn Foster. She is a Democrat from District 27 out of Pine Ridge. In the 100th session of the South Dakota State Legislature kicks off on January 14th with the State of the State address from Governor Kristi Noem. The session ends on March 13th. They're back again with Veto Day on March 31st. We're going to start with Scott Odenbach. Thanks for coming up. What do you see? What's going to be the big issues coming around in the legislature this time through?
Well, thank you, Jack, and great to be here. There are some big issues we're facing. I think as the COVID money drops off and all that was washing around that was being spent the last few years, that's going to be a big issue we're facing, and Chairman Derby will talk about that, of course. But obviously property taxes, I think, is probably the biggest issue when you talk about meeting with your constituents or polling the members of our caucus in the House like I have. There's a lot of people hurting from that around the state. When you combine what's happening with property taxes plus homeowners insurance, it's something that we need to address. Obviously, eminent domain reform and the carbon pipelines was a huge issue. It affected our primaries in the Republican Party and the elections. That's going to be something that people should be looking for bills and issues on. I think school choice is going to be a big issue this year. The governor talked about it in her budget address, and I'm looking forward to working with the governor and their office on something with that. We've got issues of election integrity you're hearing from people about. We dodged a bullet this last election cycle with constitutional amendments, and I think there's going to be some movement on that as well, possibly reforming that process. So I could go on, but those are the big ones, and expect to have a really interesting and busy session dealing with those issues.
Representative Mike Derby, what do you think are going to be the big issues you're going to see in Pierre this year?
Well, Jack, thanks. I'm glad to be here. First of all, let me just start out. You referred to it as the 100th legislative session. And if you look on the governor's budget, it says our 136th year of a balanced budget. So people often ask me, what's the difference? What happened? Well, when the state of South Dakota first became a state, they only met every other year. And that's why it's the 100th.
So I didn't have it wrong.
No, I'm sorry. You had that look on your face there for a minute, but you had it exactly right. And so I like to say it's the 136th year of a balanced budget. That's in our Constitution, and we'll do it again. We balanced it last year. We'll do it again this year. I think the big issues, of course, the governor laid out her budget address, and as we say, that's a suggestion. That's a starting point for all of us. And so we start out with the budget book, and we're going through that right now, and lots of cuts in there because the revenues are not coming in as projected. And that's probably the biggest issue, as Leader Odenbach referred to. We're probably getting back to more normal years, obviously, than the past three. And so we'll be working with that, going through all the budgets, looking at the future revenue projections, and hopefully December's numbers will come in shortly, and hopefully it reverses a trend. We're behind projections. Some months we're actually behind year to date, and that's not a good scenario that you want to be in. So we'll see if we get a post-presidential election bump, and if the holidays were good for everybody. But my big concern is the agricultural commodity markets and how that's affecting the state.
Senator Red Dawn Foster, what are you looking for in Pierre this year? What do you think is going to be the issues from your perspective?
Well, in addition to everything that's been said, I would like to also agree that property, local control is going to be a big issue, as well as education, and the prison, and looking at how much funding is going there, and is that the right direction that we should go using that type of funding. So I think that the ingestion law will come into play, and looking at what's the best way to address our criminal justice system, and are we meeting the needs of the community, or are we just creating more harms with the current system? So I think, in addition to everything, those are kind of my top three areas.
What are your priorities coming into the session this year?
So priorities, local control is always a big priority. Looking at the tax on food was on the ballot, but I think that that may come up and tweaked in a way that really meets our South Dakota needs of looking at just maybe some creative ways that we can address that, but from our perspective and our, a nuanced South Dakota perspective on that.
Mike, what are your personal priorities coming into this?
Well, that's a great question. This will be my second term chairing the House Committee on Appropriations, and I'm also co-chair of the Joint Committee on Appropriations. So I learned early on that sometimes you have to lay aside some of your personal priorities for the good of the caucus and what's happening. My number one priority, obviously, is to get a final vote and pass the general appropriations bill. And so that's a big deal, and I'll be firmly focused on that. I'm not carrying any bills myself. There's really not time in appropriations to do that effectively, I've found. And so I'm all about the budget. Looking forward to the caucus priorities. We're starting to determine those, and then we'll probably rank them, and then we, at the end of session, we'll negotiate with the Senate, and we'll see where it all ends up.
Scott, how about you? What are your personal priorities coming into the session this year?
Well, yeah, and to echo Mike just a little bit, it's a bit different when you're the majority leader. We have the largest caucus we've had since, I think, 1952 now. So, as he alluded to, we've done some polling of the caucus to see where the members are, and that has to be my focus, is to try to, if I can, gather all that up and get us going in the same direction. Personally, I've been working ever since I got in the legislature on education issues. I call it education innovation, and I think that and property tax relief are two priority issues for our caucus. For me personally, I think they're also intertwined, frankly. We're not going to be able to have long-term, meaningful property tax relief until we reform, in my view, how we deliver education. It takes up over 60% of your property tax dollars, and homeowners are hurting, and so we've got to address that. Obviously, the prison, I think it's a huge budget number. It's something that our caucus is going to be wrestling with. I know there are some people from the area in their district where the prison's going to be built that have a pretty different viewpoint than some folks in the administration as far as pushing ahead with this, so I know we're going to have to navigate that. So those are some of the biggies, I guess, for me, and the things that I'm looking forward to dealing with.
Now, Governor Kristi Noem has been nominated to be the next Homeland Security Secretary. If she takes that job and goes, that leaves Lieutenant Governor Larry Roden as the new governor. How does that change things in the session? How does that change things from your guys' perspective?
Well, I think there's going to be pretty good continuity. I've had some good conversations with Governor Noem and Lieutenant Governor Roden on some of the, what some of their priorities are right now, and just making sure, are those going to be continued when and if we have the changeover. So I think for this session, my expectation anyway would be continuity, more of the same, hopefully conservative governance that we've seen. That would be coming forth from the Roden administration.
Mike, do you see any changes if it goes from Noem to Roden?
Well, this has never happened before where there's been a change in the middle of a legislative session. So I'm not predicting big changes. It's the governor's budget. Usually, on the last two times, remember, Knight left, and that was filled by Harvey Woolman back in the day, and then we had the unfortunate crash of Governor Mickelson, and then Walter Dale Miller stepped in. So this is the first time it's ever happened during the middle of a session. The big question we're all wondering is, who's going to be lieutenant governor? And that's created an interesting list of prospects, and so we're all very curious about that. Will they have legislative experience? Will they, if you remember, Steve Kirby came in and had no legislative experience and stepped into that role, so it can be done, but it would be helpful. I would predict that it'll be someone that has some past legislative experience. Then you do the matrix, East River, West River, male, female, so a lot of dynamics.
Red Dawn, how about you? Does any change if it's Governor Noem or Governor Roden?
Yeah, well, I think one opportunity there would be is to work with the tribes and try to get better lines of communication and just have the opportunity to work together in a way that may have not happened in the past.
All right, we got to take a quick break. We'll continue our look at the upcoming legislative session here in South Dakota when we continue with this month's edition of Focus. I'm Jack Caudill. Welcome back to this month's edition of Focus, talking about the upcoming 100th session of the South Dakota State Legislature. Representative Mike Derby is a Republican from Rapid City in District 34. Governor Noem proposed a $7.29 billion budget, down a little bit from the year before. Now, a couple of things that were added money in there: educational savings accounts for $4 million, $3,000 for students for private schooling. How would that work, and is that something that you see going to make it through the legislature?
Well, great question. And first of all, let me put a little perspective on the total budget. Out of that $7.3 billion, more than half of that are federal dollars. So when we start looking at our budget, we're looking at general fund dollars, which are primarily generated by sales tax. And so this year, the governor did over 70 to 80 million in cuts, first of all, to try and get things in line with the lower sales tax part of it. And so the enhanced savings accounts is an additional, that's a plus up. That's a new program, new money. And so this is a kind of a zero-sum game here. If we want to add more to something, we have to cut something at this point in time. It's a new program. It's a whole new idea. I know Leader Odenbach is running that through the process, and we as appropriators, we're at the very, very beginning of the whole process. So for me to weigh in at this point in time is just too premature.
Representative Scott Odenbach, Republican out of Spearfish, District 31. I know you are in favor of that, the education savings accounts, I believe. How does that work, and do you see that going through?
I think it has a better chance of going through than other similar ideas have in the past few years. How it works is we're almost there, I think, to be ready to release a bill, but essentially how it works is you commit a certain sum. It's probably going to be based off the per student equivalent that the state already spends for kids in the public schools. And if it's a percentage of that, that would get put into an education savings account. There would be guardrails and rules on how it could be spent. But essentially then the parents could direct the money towards, either a private school. There's micro schools popping up all over South Dakota. There's alternative education home schools. So there's a number of uses that parents could put the money to really tailor their child's education. And at the same time, as I said before, I think we begin to innovate our education system and how that product is delivered. And it'll make our public schools better in the long run as well, and save taxpayers money as we decentralize things, as we frankly bring a 19th century model into the 21st century.
Senator Red Dawn Foster, a Democrat out of Pine Ridge, District 27. What's your view on the education savings accounts?
So we have the initial framework, but I think the devil's in the details and how it will impact our community, the Oshete Shokoi, the 9 tribes that are here, as well as natives that are living in the urban area, will be very nuanced. And to look at exactly how that impacts them will determine where we fall on this. But I'm supportive of innovation and education and know that it impacts our community greatly. It is something that needs to be addressed. We've brought bills in the past, and so we are looking forward to kind of what the opportunity is now.
Nobody likes their budget to be cut, but you said cuts have to be made at some point. 2 of the ones you've heard probably the most talk about, $3.6 million to public broadcasting, $1 million to the state library, have generated a lot of talk. What's the situation with those, and do you figure those are going to stick?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. Those are probably the 2 cuts that have generated the most phone calls and emails for me personally. And for public broadcasting, that's been looked at in the past, and we're going to take a hard look at it from this standpoint. Number one, we've created a separate budget hearing time for South Dakota Public Broadcasting. We want to get all the information and the data that we can before we make a decision. It's a significant cut from their budget. It's taking about $5.5 million in general funds and reducing it by $3.6 million. So leaving about $2 million in general funds. That is a big cut, we get it. Second thing we're doing in appropriations is we have work groups where we identify hot topics and we spend more time on those. And so we've created 4 work groups, and one of those will be South Dakota Public Broadcasting. So we'll have plenty of time to get all the data, get all the information, and make the decision. The library component, I'll be honest, I'm just getting into the learning curve in regards to the state library, particularly the resources that they provide to local libraries. Probably more than I even envisioned. So we're going to be taking a hard look at that too.
Senator Red Dawn Foster, what's your look on those 2 cuts, the library
on
and
those
public
2 cuts?
broadcasting?
Well, I'm on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. I think that we should be increasing those budgets. Last year, South Dakota Public Radio Station took a cut that had affected them, and I think just again those nuanced looks of what they bring, the value that they bring to the community. It's basically the flavor of South Dakota. It's very important. They hold the legislature information as well as L&I and other things that the community really benefit from. So I am not a fan of any budget cuts to their.
Representative Scott Odenbach, your thoughts on those 2?
Yeah, thank you. I've had some good discussions with a number of the officials at Public Broadcasting since this was announced. And, you know, I've told a number of folks, as Mike mentioned, we've been hearing from a lot of people, had a lot of emails and stuff on that. And it's in a way, it's philosophical. Do we just target the cuts at certain things, or do we more look for across the board, more broad-based cuts to reduce everybody a little bit to come up with the money to do things like property tax relief, balance the budget, et cetera? I mean, I grew up in a small town of Eureka, you know, watching Nova, watching these nature programs, a lot of the stuff that you can learn something from, frankly, and obviously appreciate what PBS does with the State House program and making sure, you know, every committee is live. People can log in and listen to it or watch it on the LRC website. It's archived, so you can go back and listen to it. So if we're talking a cut of that level, they're going to have to make some real decisions about which pieces to leave in place and which are the top things that we have to have. So it's going to be something. I'm glad to hear the chairman said that there's going to be a work group that will look at that specifically and see how that kind of folds into all the rest of the budget choices we're going to be having to make.
Now, you mentioned a few times through the show here about property tax relief. What are some of the options to get that done, and how much do you hear from people in your district saying you need to get that done?
Well, it's the top thing I hear. I recall, I think it was 2 years ago now, I came out and went to a public meeting down at Johnson Siding down here, and there had to be 300 people probably in that room, and there was some real passion, some tough stories, frankly, and I hear them in Lawrence County as well, people who basically have their place paid for, but when you take a look at the property taxes combined with the homeowner's insurance, even with it paid for, they can't afford to live there. So we've got one proposal that's been brought out on the table so far. There'll be more. The one now is to raise the sales tax to 5%, to raise the money to get rid of some of the levies that go to education, have the state take that over and give the relief to the people. I'm not sure in the current legislative makeup that we have whether raising one tax to cut another is going to make it through. I don't know. We'll have to see what the caucus says. Other than that, you know, you need to look at cuts, and government has had a number of really good years as far as the spending that's been fully funding and things like that. And so if we take a little bit from everybody, as the saying goes, we can do a lot. And we really got to try to prioritize the taxpayers. And there's a lot of lobbyists all the time in the building and pier, but we got to remember who are the lobbyists for the taxpayers that are actually paying all the bills for all the programs too.
All right, we got to take another break. We'll continue our look at the South Dakota State Legislature when we continue with this month's edition of Focus. I'm Jack Caudill. Welcome back to this month's edition of Focus. This month we are previewing the 100th session of the South Dakota State Legislature, which kicks off on January 14th at the state capitol in Pierce. Senator Red Dawn Foster is a Democrat from District 27 out of Pine Ridge. Looking at this session, what are the issues important to Indian country that you see coming up this year?
So Indian country, again, education, and looking at how this education bill will affect Indian country and Indian education. Also, local control is an issue. It's nuanced. Looking at our environmental water, land and water, what's the mining? Is there a way to address that? And then criminal justice reform, is a hot topic, and looking at how the ingestion laws disproportionately impact Indian country is also on our top list.
Now, Rick Weiland, the sponsor of Amendment G, which failed to put abortion rights into the state constitution, has called on the legislature to put some exceptions into the law. And some of the ads that even to get people to vote against that said maybe these laws will change a little bit. Do you see that happening? Do you see that going anywhere in the session this year?
Well, do I see? Yeah, I'm sure there will be a number of bills to address that. I haven't been a party of those discussions at this point. Obviously, I'm just focused on the budget at this time, but fully expect to see some bills that are relevant to that issue.
Representative Scott Odenbach is a Republican Majority Leader out of District 31 in Spearfish. Do you see that drive going anywhere to put some exceptions into the state abortion laws?
Well, as Mike said, it's possible we'll see bills on it. It hasn't been something, you know, as I've been polling the caucus members, that has been a top priority, frankly. I think people maybe in a way have a bit of a hangover from all the battles that went into defeating Amendment G or being on the side of passing it, depending on your point of view. But I kind of get the sense maybe people are wanting to take a breather from that issue for a little bit. So I'm kind of in a wait and see mode to see if we're going to have bills to try to address that with all the other things going on.
And the state sales tax reduction has been a battle for a number of years now. Where do you see that coming up this time?
Well, as the governor has, you know, she had called it a tax holiday when we were unable the last time when we did cut it, to make that cut permanent, right? It had a sunset provision in it. And so now, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we've got one proposal to raise it back up again to 5% to use the money for property tax relief. Again, I'm not sure that we're going to have a makeup in the legislature that's going to be in the mood to raise taxes this year. We'll have to see. I mean, we're really balancing the issue of obviously a strong desire to give some relief, especially to homeowners. But the concern is if we raise that sales tax up to cut another one, eventually 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the road, whatever it is, the other tax creeps back up and then you just end up with a higher tax burden overall.
You see any changes in sales tax this time through?
Well, let me give you a little history in regards to this. Under Dugard, if it was 4%, and then there was a huge battle, if you recall, to take it to 4.5%, and a majority of that money was to be used for education. That's my understanding. I wasn't in Pierre at that time, and so then it was at 4.5 for a while, and then as part of the negotiations here a couple years ago, we did reduce it to 4.2 with the sunset, as was mentioned. So it's been a bit of a ping pong ball in regards to that. But keep in mind, even going to 5%, we're probably one of the lower states in regards to sales tax amount in the region. So remains to be seen. It's something that would be dedicated. So it'd be money in, money out. So wouldn't really affect the rest of the budget that much.
Just about out of time here. Red Dawn, one question to you. Democrats wildly outnumbered in Pierre. It is 64-6 in the House, 32-3 in the Senate. How do you get your voice heard still?
Well, I'm happy to say that there's a lot of great nonpartisan and collaboration that goes on, because you have, as a citizen legislature, you have individuals there that just really care about South Dakota. And there's a lot of shared values, and even if the details and nuances are not there, I'm really happy to be a part of the legislature and working with people who want to just make South Dakota a better place.
Right. We are all the way out of time. Senator Red Dawn Foster, Representative Mike Derby, Representative Scott Odenbach, thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you again the first Sunday night of next month. Good night.